us great. So very warm welcome to the webinar. And before I introduce the panelists, maybe just a few housekeeping announcements. This webinar is going to run for 2 hours. To make the session more engaging, we're going to have 2 Q&A sessions. The very first one is going to happen after the first 2 panelists make their presentations, and the second will happen towards the end of the panel. As we go along, I encourage all our attendees to note their questions down on the YouTube live chat boxes so that we can take as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. And of course, these questions or feedback or comments are going to be channeled to me by our technical team. As you are including your questions or feedback on the YouTube live chat box, please include your name, your location, and the organization that you're affiliated with so we can know where the questions are coming from. I'd like also to ask our viewers to tweet using the following hashtags: hashtag Kafala Explained, which is the name of the webinar, and also hashtag Send Us Home Kenya. So in today's webinar, we have a very happy to welcome our diverse group of panelists who will share their insights into Kafala, which, as many of you know, is a system that governs the employment of foreign workers in various countries in the Middle East. I'd like to introduce the panelists now, and I'll do so in speaker order. We have Ali Mohammed, who works for Migrant Rights and is based in Bahrain. His role with Migrant Rights allows him to work very closely with migrant workers from Asia and from Africa as well, based in Bahrain, but then also to provide direct support to these migrant workers beyond Bahrain to other countries in the Gulf and to advocate for their rights. We have our second speaker, whose name is Aida Muli, who worked in Kenya's banking and hospitality sector before relocating to Bahrain late last year, after losing her job following the terrorist attacks on Nairobi's Dusit Hotel in January 2019. Our third panelist is Zain Lawson, who is one of the 4 co-founders of This Is Lebanon, a non-profit organization that works to support and advocate for the rights of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. Our final panelist is Abina Danso, who comes from Ghana and is currently based in Accra, who has the experience of working as a migrant domestic worker in Lebanon, and who is now back home in Accra, working as a caseworker for This Is Lebanon. Ali, let's start with you, and you can jump right into the presentations now. And I'll start with what might appear to be a very simple geographical question. Perhaps if you can tell us, for the sake of our Kenyan listeners, what countries make up the GCC group of states? What do they have in common in terms of culture and geopolitics? But then also in very simple terms, what is the history of Kafala and what countries subscribe to this system? Over to you, Ali. Thank you.
Hello?
Ali, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. So as you may know, I'm based in Bahrain, and it's the smallest of the 6 countries that make up the GCC countries, the others being Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and UAE. And they're all in close proximity along the Persian Gulf. So although these countries all have their own socio-political and cultural specificities, what they all share in common in varying degrees is their dependence on oil for revenues, and of course the Kafala system that we're going to talk about. And also, of course, the Arabic language and Islamic culture. And I think around today, around 30 million migrants are living in this geographic area, and are subjected to the Kafala system. Now, Kafala is basically where the sponsor assumes legal responsibility and representation over the sponsored migrant labor within the country. The word Kafala itself has its roots in Sharia law, in which a party, say kafil, provides a legal guarantee on behalf of another party, which is in Arabic called makful, similar to a guarantor, if you say. However, as a system and its practice as a labor migration system in particular, it has really nothing to do with Islamic law or culture. In fact, it its origins can be traced to the British colonial era in the region, where the British colonial administrators introduced this sponsorship requirements in order to control labor migration in the pearl industry shortly before the discovery of oil in the region. And its use was further regularized and widely applied with increasing migrant labor coming to the Gulf. And today it's been put in place in practice through an extensive body of bureaucratic procedures that regulate the relationship between the sponsor or the employer, the migrant, and the state. So to just put it in give the tenets of kafala, and although these vary across these Gulf countries and across time, the main tenets of kafala could be said, it's the entry and residency visa. No worker can enter this region without a local sponsor who only can obtain this visa. Most of the time, it is a national. And then exit visas as well, like a visa for the migrant to exit the country. Today, only Saudi Arabia has this restriction, and no objection certificates or change in employment. So a certificate is required before a migrant can change jobs, in which the current sponsor declares he or she has no objection to the worker transferring jobs. So almost all foreign residents are in this region are regulated by kafala, with the exception of course, investors or those who bought properties and can tie their residency to their property or investment and not to a sponsor. So overall, this is the kafala system as it is historically and it's in its current form.
Thank you for that contextual analysis, Ali. Just moving on to just more detailed understanding of kafala. We are aware from in this part of the world, of course, that, and we see a lot of media coverage on kafala and on the experiences of migrant workers in not just GCC states, but also other countries in the Middle East. So just clarification really on which countries prescribed to kafala, and would you describe it as a form of labor policy or law? Because you've talked about it being regulatory procedures, but would you really describe it as a law or as a policy? And then just quite secondly, moving tied to that, in terms of what, in practical terms, what does it mean for migrant workers from Kenya and from other parts of the world?
So as I said, the countries that operate under the kafala system to varying degrees is Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and Lebanon and Jordan to certain degrees as well. And there are around the world as well, other countries like Singapore or other places that have something similar for some migrant workers that tie their residency to an employer. So it's not just exclusively to the Gulf, but it's widely used here. Now, it's important to note that this is not really a labor law, but a system that regulates migration. And I say this because people and the media at times can get these things mixed, and governments sometimes use labor reforms as PR to say that we have abolished kafala. So when Lebanon, Qatar, or Bahrain implemented reforms in its labor laws, many were quick to point that this is the end of kafala. But the main tenets of kafala are still in place. As long as the residency of a migrant is tied to the private employer, kafala system is in place. But while kafala is not a labor law, it is a work-tied residency system, which intrinsically gives disproportionate power to employers. So as the state delegates responsibility to the employers come to wield power to control migrant workers' movements and their labor. So an employer can terminate or threaten to deport a migrant worker And this power can and is misused, by many employers in the Gulf and other places. For example, like say if a worker tries to, file a complaint against an employer, the employer has the power, because the state has delegated responsibility to him, to file absconding charges, or which is when workers leave the place of employment. This can prevent migrants from leaving the country or hinder justice when workers file the complaint, as you said, or subject them to deportation. If that answered your question.
It does, Ali. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for that. And I guess maybe just speaking more about what you've mentioned about reforms. From what we've read, Bahrain was the first country in the GCC to work towards improving its kafala-related regulations. Would you say, and especially in 2020, because this has been a very interesting year for everyone around the world, and difficult in many ways, in more ways than one. Have things improved for migrant workers since these reforms, I believe, first started in 2009, and particularly when you think about migrant domestic workers?
In 2009, the Bahraini government basically issued a decree allowing all migrant workers to change jobs, without the current sponsor's approval, provided that they notify the employer at a certain time. But what happened is that employers fiercely resisted this move, and the government amended this decision in 2011. This required a migrant worker to work for at least 1 year to be allowed to transfer sponsorship without approval. But this did have some help for migrants to, it materially helped migrants to change employers, say, after a year. However, it's the transfer rates of jobs is low, in part because low-income workers often lack resources and guidance to change their employment. It's not a very easy process, and for example, Qatar recently as well removed the no objection certificate for workers to change employers, given that they give a proper notice period. But implementation has been a bit difficult, and a lot of times migrants need assistance with that. And when it comes to domestic workers in Bahrain, they remain excluded from critical protections, such as fixed minimum wage limit, any limits to working hours, mandatory rest hours, and weekly day offs, and so on. So I think in my opinion, Bahrain is one of the worst countries in terms of providing legal framework for domestic workers, although they were the first countries to introduce reforms and include domestic workers partially, in a very little articles in the labor law. But as it is today, domestic workers are still subjected to horrific working conditions and conditions that amount to human trafficking and so on. And the reforms that came after 2009, such as in 2017, Bahrain introduced flexi permit work that allows migrant workers to self-sponsor themselves. And also in 2018, Bahrain enacted a decree to against sexual harassment in the workplace. All these two reforms, domestic workers have been excluded from. So we haven't like seen, not just in Bahrain, but in the Gulf, like a lot of the reforms has been excluding domestic workers in general.
Thank you very much for that, Ali. And my final question to you is very specific to the experiences of what you've seen actually in Bahrain. And given that Migrant Rights, the organization that you work for, also has a regional mandate. You work in other countries as well in the GCC. Maybe you can share some of the observations you've had this year in terms of the experiences of Kenyan migrant workers, both male and female. Obviously, we understand that there's a high demand for domestic workers in Bahrain and other countries in the region. But perhaps if you could just share the experiences of Kenyan migrant workers in Bahrain and the rest of the GCC. And then maybe you can share with us as well in terms of data, numbers. How many Kenyans are we seeing currently working in Bahrain? What sectors are they working in? And as I said, how would you describe their experiences, especially this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, sure. Kenyan migration to Bahrain, and I think in Gulf in general, has been quite a recent phenomena. Like there's been a gradual increase in migration from Kenya, mainly due to the higher cost of recruitment and wages of regular workers or domestic workers from other countries that either signed a bilateral agreement with Bahrain or other Gulf countries for minimum wages and so on. In Bahrain, there are like majority of the Kenyan workers in Bahrain, though they are little in number compared to other places. They work majority in the service sector, security, cleaning companies, and domestic work. And what they face here is what, large degree what many low-income migrants face who are subjected to migrant Kafala system. And what we see, especially with Kenya here, is that with Kenyan migrants, is that many domestic workers come here and they've been told that they have a job for them in, like, say, school or in a cleaning company. But when they come here, they end up as domestic work. And I'm sure Ida will speak about her experiences here. And what happens is that when they come here and they find out that it's not, the contract is not, or the job is not what was promised back home, and they end up leaving the workplace, and almost every time the employer lodges an absconding charges against them. That renders them irregular, and they just stay stranded in Bahrain, unable to work in another place, or find a regular way to find income, and or subject to arrests and deportations. And since the pandemic, things, all these has been exacerbated. Many migrants who back then they could, like, for example, work irregularly or work in cleaning companies, their jobs, they have been terminated, and it's been difficult for them to earn any income. And then because they have absconding charges on them, they cannot leave the country, so they're just stranded here, depending on charity or social workers to remove those absconding charges and get them tickets to go back home. And these are the main issues. And of course, like, since the pandemic, basically no one is paying anyone right now in Bahrain, and we have astronomically high cases of wage theft, non-payment of wages, and labor abuses, and many other issues like that.
Thank you for that, Ali. I guess in terms of data, statistics, you know, I see on the presentation that you say there are about 2,000, just over 2,000 workers with regular work permits. But in terms of the total number of Kenyan migrant workers in Bahrain, both documented and undocumented, you know, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
I can't say, because like even these datas are like, the Gulf countries have this problem of lack of transparency, and it's very difficult to get data about these things. And like these data is from 2019, and it's hard to say like how many are irregular. But even like in this, given that there are only few thousand numbers, it is the case that there are a lot of Kenyans that seek to us for help, which means that, you know, a big number of them are having issues here. A lot of it, you know, has to do with the recruitment channels not being proper, and like, for example, what happened to Ada, which you will explain. And there is also these in Bahrain, like this article that is mentioned in the presentation, like there is this thing like kind of ethos with the Bahraini recruitment agencies and in the media. They tend to not only use, you know, racist and language towards, you know, migrants specifically from Africa, but Kenyan domestic workers here, like this article from September, like it mentions like Kenyans are quote unquote, like it's not my language, but prone to, you know, leave the abscond from the employment's house, not mentioning though why they leave the place. What were they told before coming? And of course, it's a human right to have the, like it's a human right to have the right to leave the employment place whenever you want. So, but as to go back to your question, it's very difficult to know, but how many are rendered irregular with this? But the problem is the lack of support that are there, both from, you know, the government not providing adequate support and shelter for specifically for Kenyan domestic workers, given that they don't have any kind of embassy representation here, which makes their plight here more difficult.
Thank you for that, Ali. And just one final question before we move on to Ida. You've mentioned absconding charges, and perhaps you can just share some more information around that, because from this part of the world, we're not very clear about what happens if a worker wants to leave, and especially, again, domestic worker who is more vulnerable than other workers, such as workers who are working in the construction sector, for instance, or, you know, workers who are working in the service industry, who do not live within their employer's place of abode. So just perhaps if you could maybe provide more information about that, what you mean by this absconding charges, and what alternatives that the migrant, especially a migrant domestic worker, have if they no longer want to continue working for their employer.
So absconding charges, like just to say, it's because of the Kafala system, employers have quote unquote responsibilities over the workers, and absconding charges is a way of employers, like a mechanism employers use when the worker is not at the workplace, and that, like by the system, employer is responsible for where the worker is. So when the worker is not there, you know, you can file absconding charges. But what happens is that usually employers misuse that to file charges again, in order to hinder any kind of movement of the employer or access to justice in case they are not paid, or travel abroad in some cases. In the case of domestic workers, it's more acute because they live within the employer's house. So in times of where there is abuse or any sort of non-labor abuse, physical abuse, and the domestic worker leaves to go to complain at the police station or anything, the employer right then could file an absconding charge, making this process of the domestic worker accessing justice harder, and at some points even impossible. And there are all sorts of ways that could do it. And even legally, in practice, there's things that are worse for domestic workers. Say, while workers in regular places like construction and other places, when an employer wants to file an absconding charge, say at the government labor ministry, usually there are a number of days that should go past that the employee is not there, and then they could file this absconding charges. Whereas for domestic workers, they can do it immediately at the police station. And then that would make everything harder for the domestic worker to seek justice.
Thank you so much for that, Ali. And we will have, towards the end of this panel, perhaps 5 minutes set aside to just talk about, more details, and perhaps if with Zain as well, once he presents on, the prospects for reforms, Kafala reforms. I'd like to hand over to Ida now, but before I do, just to encourage our attendees who are listening in on YouTube Live to start sharing their feedback on the chat box and any questions I might have, because there's going to be a 10-minute Q&A once Ida presents before we hear from both Zain and Abina. So Ida, thank you first of all so much for having the courage to share your life story with us. And I think it's great that you're talking after Ali, because you, for just over a year, were based in Bahrain. So before I ask you questions about your experiences in Bahrain, perhaps you can share with us about a little bit about yourself, what your education and professional background is, and what you were doing in Kenya before you moved to Bahrain last year.
You're muted, Ida.
Ida, over to you. Please unmute your mic.
Okay, now we start.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I'm Ida. I'm in my mid-30s, a mother of two. My professional background is I studied IT and business administration at the Technical University of Nairobi, Kenya. And I also did French at Alliance Française. I'm studying sign language and psychology and counseling at the Chameleons, Dennis Pritt Road in Nairobi, waiting for my graduation. And currently doing some projects for recycling and empowering women, and doing an initiative for encouraging women not to fall prey for these experiences that I went through. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Ida. That's quite inspiring. It sounds like you're doing a lot since you got back. What drove you, maybe what were you doing before you moved to Bahrain last year, and what drove you to look for a job in Bahrain?
First of all, I was working in a banking institution in the marketing department for 3 years. Then my contract ended. And because I had training in the banking and cashiering, I got a job with the hotel industry where I was working as a cashier, and also in the management as a supervisor. And sometimes I could sit for the manager at the Dusit complex. That was my last employment. So in January 2019, we had some terror attacks at the premises of work where we lost colleagues and friends who died. Then the hotel was closed down. So from then it was so traumatizing. So I had to take my time to heal. As I started to heal, I did my farming project and started to tarmac because I have bills to pay, I have loans to pay. I had some constructions to do back at home. That's when I met another lady. She told me she takes people to Bahrain. And she told me to give me her number. That was the day before I was going for an interview somewhere. I was introduced to her through my brother-in-law. And after the interview, I told her I will call her back. Then she was like, what have you studied? Kindly send me your CV. I can get you a good job in Bahrain. So before that, I Googled about Bahrain. I wanted to know more about Bahrain. And in the Google, it shows that it's a small country with a population of 1 million people. And there are so many expatriates. So I didn't think that it has some issues like other Gulf countries. So I was comfortable to share my passport copy with her through WhatsApp. And she ended up like hooking up with an agency in Bahrain, the ones who processed my visa and everything. Everything happened within a week. It was too fast. And she called me like, tomorrow you're traveling. We want us to meet at the airport.
Thank you, Ida. And of course, before we talk about your experiences in Bahrain, just to clarify for our non-Kenyan listeners that tarmac is Kenyan lingo for job hunting. Yeah. So when Ida says she tarmacked, it means that she was looking for a job and, walking around the streets of Nairobi looking for a job. So you said that everything happened within a week in terms of, speaking to this agent and, of course, also getting all your documentation in order. Just to clarify from you, was this one of the agents that is on the list of agencies that are accredited by the Ministry of Labor? Were you aware that that is the usual procedure?
No, I wasn't aware because that day when I met her, she was like escorting some ladies to the airport. And she told me if I don't have a job, I can always contact her. So I thought she's a genuine person because when I handed over my passport to her, through WhatsApp, when we were chatting, she introduced me to the other agent in Bahrain. And the agent in Bahrain was so promising, only to realize that she's not even registered in Bahrain. And she's not also registered here in Kenya. So I regret because I made a mistake. And I would like other Kenyans to be keen. When they hear about the jobs in the Gulf, they need to investigate first and know more details about the recruitment agencies.
All right, Ida, thank you for that. And just moving on to your arrival now. When did you arrive in Bahrain? And perhaps what happened when you got there? And how would you describe your living and working conditions during your time there?
Okay, before I traveled, the agent in Bahrain connected me with a lady. She told me there's a lady who works in the office in Bahrain, and she told me she's going to give the lady my number. So we started communicating with the lady, and the lady told me she's doing some studies and she might give me a job at the office because she's going to get a promotion at work. And she told me I won't have a problem with a place to stay because she's going to host me. And when I arrived, I left Kenya on Thursday, the 7th November, 2019. And I arrived at Bahrain on 8th. I was on transit in Dubai for close to 15 hours. So the agent in Bahrain was waiting for me. She had told me to take a photograph of me and another Kenyan lady because we were only two going. But the list that I had for my traveling and insurance and everything else was brought by another agency. It's not the lady's documents, but now she has attached other documents with my visa and medical. So at the airport is when she handed over the documents at the Jomo Kenyatta airport. And when I got inside the airport, my mom took me in because she has the pass. So we entered, we checked in, and the airline told me that my cargo, the suitcase, I'm not carrying anything because they didn't pay for it, even food. So I was like, starving for like 24 hours. When I arrived in Bahrain, I'm meeting strangers, not the lady that I was talking to, because the agent told me the lady is not around. So I'm going with these strangers to their place. And she can't take me to her place because she has another Kenyan. So I was like, I don't have anyone or anywhere to go. I'll just go with the couple. I went with the couple to their place. And when I arrived there, the lady was working for Ministry of Education and the husband works for the airline. I didn't know that I was going to work as a domestic worker. It was my first experience. And I met other Ethiopian ladies in the family who were going through some hardships, and we didn't communicate well because they don't know English and they're being mistreated too. So from that day, I was traumatized and I became more like, I was feeling like I'm afraid. I don't have communication. I've not communicated with my family because the only person I could communicate with was my agent from Kenya. I told her about the situation, what happened. I didn't find the people who were supposed to pick me. I was picked by strangers. She didn't inform me that. So she was like not responding back to my chats until the day that I told her I'm going to commit suicide. Is when she saw that I'm serious and she told the other agent in Bahrain to keep an eye on me. So the lady told the couple that I'm not comfortable to work as a domestic worker in their house. And when I told them that I'm no longer interested with the work, I want to resign, they were like, you didn't come here for holiday and you're supposed to work for us. You'll work without salary for 3 months. I told them, you'd never told me, I never knew you, so I won't listen to your terms. I want to quit this job. Even if it's taking me to the police, I don't mind. So that's how I left the job that I worked for like a month. Then they told me they won't give me my documents until they like take them back to the agency so that they can cancel the visa. So I was taken back to the agency. There's an apartment for staff, the ones who are doing cleaning and other jobs, even hospitality jobs. But because I'm a Kenyan, they don't give Kenyans an opportunity to work in different jobs. That was the rule for that agency. So I had to go to work to another residence. Yeah, so I ended up being sold to another family that I was supposed to stay for 3 months. They ended up taking a visa for 2 years without my consent and without asking me. So the agency had told me I'm just going to stay there until they finish the processing of my visa cancellation so that I can come back home. So the process was to end in March. When I reminded the next family that I was working for that I'm supposed to return back to my country and my mom is ready to pay for my ticket, they were like, you didn't come here for holiday and we're giving you 10 minutes to leave our compound. So I didn't know anyone. I called the police and that's how I met the Migrant Rights organization and had Kenya through the police. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And as I said earlier, it takes a lot of courage for you to share this story. So thank you for having that courage. When you were still in Bahrain, did you have any opportunity to interact with other Kenyans, both men and women working there? We've heard from Ali that Kenyans are working in the doing domestic work. They're working in other sectors as well. But based on your interactions with some of the Kenyans, what kind of work were they doing and how did you describe the experiences?
Okay, the first time I met a Kenyan lady in a restaurant as I went out with my employers and she gave me her contact. So the police officers, they asked me if I know any Kenyan who can accommodate me because the shelters were closed due to COVID-19 pandemic. So I couldn't leave the police station until this Kenyan lady could come and release me from the police because we don't have a Kenyan embassy in Bahrain. And Kenyan representatives, like volunteers who are helping Kenyans, are always overwhelmed with work and they can't respond to calls at the police station. So the police officers filed for me a case so that I can get back my documents. So the Kenyan lady told me because she's working for the hotel, she can't accommodate me. It might ruin her career. she will get me a Kenyan lady who can house me, and maybe we can share rent. So that's the time I went to the streets and I started to live outside in the city. I met different Kenyan ladies, both women and men. During that time, it was in March and April. Most of them had lost their jobs because of the pandemic. Most restaurants, malls were closed down. Some cleaning companies have already fired their employees. And when I interacted with some Kenyans, some are stranded, they don't have their documents, they don't have their passports. They went through some abuse and hostility while they were doing jobs as domestic workers. That's why they escaped and they decided to start staying on their own. Some are working in different places, some in supermarkets. Other women are like into prostitution because of the challenges of paying rent and buying food. But I used to talk to them and encourage them to report the matter to the police so that they can get back their documents and they can be helped come back home instead of suffering in a country that they don't know anyone. But in December, the government of Bahrain had announced that it will deport people back who don't have documents. So I think most of them have taken an action of going to the LMRA office to report that they ran away from work, and they are tracing their employers so that they may get back their documents. But these agencies, they usually ask the Kenyans who went to Bahrain to return back the money, to refund the money for visa. Like myself, I was told to refund back 700 dinar. And I won the case because I didn't sign anything. I didn't have any records showing that they had paid for me 700 dinar. So the police told me I have a right to get back my documents. And the agency is the one to blame because now this boss is innocent. He didn't know that I was going to stay for 3 months. The office lied to me that I'm going for 3 months, but then they extended my stay when they were canceling the visa for the first employer. But he apologized, I dropped the charges against the boss. Now the case was between me and the agency. So after my case, the agency was closed down. And right now, I have some Kenyans who are still staying in the same agency. I communicate with them. They're still going through hardships inside that office because they're supposed to pay the money for visa so that they can get back home. That's a challenge. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Aida. Before I ask my final question, I think just a point of clarity. You of course went to Bahrain expecting to work in an office, and then you ended up working as a domestic worker in two separate homes. During that period of time, and from my understanding, from what you've shared with us, it was in total under 6 months of work. Were you paid at all by those two employers?
The first employer said that he won't pay me. They never paid me because they said I will work for 3 months without anything. And the other employer, the second one, told me I was on orientation for the 3 months. And after some time, she confirmed that because we were two, I was like working as a chef. And there's another Ethiopian lady who was doing the cleaning jobs. But sometimes she could tell me, because this other lady is not doing anything, I'm not going to pay you. And I told her, I didn't sign any contract with you. You have a right to pay me. That's when she realized she's doing something bad. She only paid me for like 2 months. That was in January and February. So March salary was not paid. And when she like kicked me out of her compound, I left my academic books and other important things because she ordered me to be returned back to Kenya. And she wants me to refund back the money she paid at the agency. She didn't want to understand anything that I didn't sign a contract with her. So they had my salary and my other books and even my clothes. So the agency threw me on the streets when I called the police. They had me calling the police because I was working and I had some the first employer had assaulted me physically. So I had an injury on my shoulder and I wanted to seek some medical attention before I returned back home. So I called the police and I told them everything, that I want to go to the hospital and I don't have the money for the hospital. I was not paid. I don't have my passport. I don't have my CPR number and I can't be treated without them. That's when the boss was called and he returned back my documents, only the passport without salary.
Thank you for that. And maybe another point of clarification on the documentation. You've mentioned that some of the Kenyans you also speak to are struggling because they might have the money for the tickets to come back home, but they don't have access to the documents, to their passports, and of course, any other relevant documentation they need to leave the country and come back home. What happens to the documents? Where are these documents? What usually happens when you arrive in Bahrain as a migrant worker? Where do these documents go to?
Okay, first of all, when you land at the airport, the agent is always waiting for you with the boss. So for me, I had my insurance from Kenya for 1.6 million that could cover for my return or medical and other letters that were attached plus visa. So my first employer took that envelope and she never returned it back. Even when I wanted to go to the hospital, I told them I have an insurance. I want to go to the hospital. They refused me to go. So you find out that when you try to air about what you're going through, they block you. So most of these Kenyans, they just escape. It's like you're going to throw trash outside the gate. That's when you disappear. Maybe very early in the morning, you can run away and go to the police station and report your boss. And maybe your boss can come there so that you can solve the matter. And some bosses, they don't even care. They let those Kenyans to just go without anything, without passports. Now, when they meet other Kenyans is when they stay together and they're recruited to other things. Some have been working, they have saved some money, but they don't have documents to come back, even passports. And when they go to the LMRA office, the records for the agents and boss, they're not seen. I have some friends that I've been communicating with. They want to come back, but they don't have the documents to come back. But they have saved some money. If they come back, they can start doing some small businesses and empower themselves.
Thank you for that, Ida. And perhaps during the Q&A session, Ali could clarify what options these Kenyans who have the money to pay for the tickets but don't have the documentation have in terms of processing this documentation that they need to come back home. But moving on to my final question, Ida, so you're back to Kenya now. Maybe a clarification of when you came back. But now that you've been back for a couple of months, just looking back on your experiences of going to Bahrain and living and working there, are there any things in the entire journey, from the time you made a decision to actually travel, to the time you actually arrived, to your work experiences there, and to your repatriation back home? Is there anything that could have gone better or you could have done differently? And again, are there any recommendations you might have? Because we have on this webinar today, colleagues from trade union organizations. We have colleagues listening in from non-government organizations in Kenya who work with migrant workers. And we also have media as well. Is there anything you would recommend to any of these actors in Kenya in terms of, how to ensure that some of these challenges you've highlighted could be addressed?
Okay, first of all, I would like to, when I was in Bahrain, I used to tell ladies that they shouldn't be doing some bad things over there because if they're arrested, they'll be deported back. For me, I made a decision to return back because I really needed to find peace. And I was going through some depression. And I met Heart Kenya. They got me a therapist who's worked with me throughout the entire journey in Bahrain when I was staying on my own, because I experienced some difficulties even when I was staying with the Kenyans. Some had tried to recruit me to join prostitution, but I told them I am I'm dignified. I can't do some things. I'd rather go back home. Even if that's how you make your money and send money back home, it's better you come back and start something. So for me, back to empower women and anyone who wants to go to work in those Gulf countries, they should do a research first and not to trust any agent who had promised them a job. Because if you go there and you're taken to a place where you didn't expect, you will go through some traumatic experiences, some sort of depression and hating yourself. Some Kenyans also have been like doing crimes. Some have committed suicide. Some have been beating up their employers. I met Kenyans who told me they came out of prison because they maybe fought with their bosses who didn't pay them. So for me, I'll advise them to return back so that they may do something back at home. It's better you suffer in your country than suffer in a foreign country. Because in Kenya, you can do a lot. You can do farming, you can do businesses, even with a little capital. We can join hands and do projects. Like myself, I'm doing recycling projects. And these projects, they are going to create jobs. I'm looking forward to creating jobs to the unemployed youths through my recycling projects. And I know these projects can extend even globally. And I thank God because through my experience in Bahrain, I also met the Migrant Rights organization that also supported me. I didn't have any income, but they used to cater for my rent, for my medication, for my food during the COVID-19. They could come and pick me up wherever I have a case to go, maybe at the police station. I had a driver, I had protection from the Arabs. And because I was told, like a Kenyan, if you like go to the police and report your boss, you might end up being assaulted. There's a time a police officer called me to find out where I was staying. And I told that officer, I can't disclose because I've already filed my case at the police station. I'm waiting for the police to call me so that I can get my documents. So you don't have the right to know where I'm staying. Right now, I'm under protection. So I thank God because I met the organization over there. I didn't know it existed. Well, we don't have a Kenyan embassy. I tried to reach out to different people in the country. Through my experience before I met the organization, I wrote a message to our governor, Charity Ngilu. I even wrote a message to the deputy president of Kenya, telling them about my experience, if they could help me raise the money so that I could refund back to the boss and return home. But they read the messages, but they never responded. So we have a big problem in Bahrain. We don't have any representative who represents Kenyans. Even the social workers are busy. Even when you call them, they don't respond back to the calls. Like I met the representatives when I was coming back home after all that time. Yet I had their contacts. I didn't have a shelter to go. That's why I ended up staying with my fellow Kenyans who are doing these illegal businesses.
Okay, Ida, thank you so much for sharing that experience. And I think before we move on to Abena, I would check whether we have any questions from our audience. And if not, perhaps I can ask Ali to respond to some of the things that Ida has shared with us. In terms of, in particular, Ali, that question of what options do the Kenyans who might have saved up enough money to purchase their tickets to come back home, what options do they have in terms of having their travel documentation processed? You've mentioned, of course, that there's no Kenyan embassy or consulate in Bahrain. But in your opinion, what is the next best? How would you advise them to, in terms of what to do in terms of processing this documentation?
So before I say like what people should do when they get their passports confiscated, the reason that happens, or it's common, again goes back to the Kafala system and how this delegation of responsibility also means that the workers themselves cannot, renew their documents, and most of the times what employers do, or when they confiscate passports, they say it's during, to complete the residency procedures or renew the visas. And then they just, do not return the passports. And they use it basically to threaten the worker, or, as we talked about, hinder their ways of accessing justice or leaving the country. So when this happens, like in few of the Gulf countries, there is a specific law that criminalizes this act. However, like even in Bahrain, like there is no specific law that says you cannot confiscate passport per se, but there are some codes in the laws of constitution that have been used in the past, to that guarantees the right of a movement, and that can be interpreted to use to get the passports back. So the problem is, again, the implementation, specifically for domestic workers. So what happens is that if a domestic worker has had her or his passport confiscated, it's very difficult. And we've tried in the past with the police telling them, there is no kind of proper mechanism for the police to go at the employer's house and retrieve the passport. What happens is that it must go through a court order, and then the court judges that the employer should return the passport. And usually the cases when it comes about passport confiscation, it happens within few months, although I'm not sure now with the COVID, it probably takes longer. And usually it almost always, in my experiences, come in favor of the worker. Again, when that happens, it usually takes a lot of months time for the court judgment comes into worker's favor to get the passport back. And in the meantime, especially if a domestic worker who cannot work elsewhere, it's very difficult to have an income and wait for the judgment process. But number one steps is that to go to the LMRA, it's the Labor Regulatory Authority of Bahrain, to lodge a complaint there. They can also lodge a complaint at the police, but the LMRA is the best authority to do that complaint. But again, there needs to be a strong implementation and enforcement, and there needs to be a new law. Bahrain needs to introduce that that specifically targets this act of passport confiscation. So yeah, that the first step would be going to the LMRA to file the complaint. If they have the ticket and everything, and they just need to get their documents back.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that clarification. I see that Abina is back online now. Abina, I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you for having the courage as well to share your story with us. You are, of course, from Ghana, and you are currently back home in Accra. You've had what Aida has shared with us in terms of her experiences in Bahrain. Are you seeing similar trends, in your country in terms of women, and men as well, leaving Ghana to go and work in the Middle East? Abena, you will need to unmute your mic.
Unmute. Okay.
We can hear you, Abena.
Yes, please. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Abena Danso from Ghana, and once a migrant worker in Lebanon. I think I've heard a lot from Aida, and think we have similar thing when it comes to West Africa. We have a similar thing here. On my experience in Lebanon was, I don't even know where to start and where to end. But before I traveled to Lebanon, I was working in my own salon here in Ghana. But these agencies here, should I say agencies? No, they are not agencies. I said street agents who have no officers lied to us, and then they will come to you, talk to you as if you're going to work in an office or a company. They will convince you, and at the end, you find yourself giving out your passport details, and then they take you from your country to Lebanon. And as soon as you get into the country, you see that things aren't the way you think it is, or the way the agents introduce everything to you.
Thank you for that, Abina. In terms of the number of people going, obviously, as Ali highlighted earlier, data is quite difficult to come across. But are you seeing that there are more and more people traveling to Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East from Ghana in search of work?
Yes. I think a huge number of women and girls as well traveling out from Ghana to, let's say, Lebanon, Jordan, Bahrain, Dubai. And then I heard something about Kurdistan too. Most of the girls in Ghana, and even as at now, we're still trying hard to stop them because they are still willing to travel out of Ghana to go to these Gulf cities. After everything that happened during some few months ago, girls returning back home, people are still traveling out of Ghana, which is very, very bad.
Thank you for that, Abina. Maybe before I move on to your experiences in Lebanon, it's interesting that you say that during this time that you are seeing trends of more and more girls wanting to travel and migrate to Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East for work. You've talked about trying to stop them, but of course, we know that people have a right to travel. In our constitution here in Kenya, it's recognized that everyone has a freedom of movement. Why is it that you feel that there's a need to restrict or to stop this girls and women from Ghana to travel to the Middle East?
Well, to me, my experience in Lebanon, and to say before when I was back home here, and then my experience in Lebanon, I think that being back home, you could make it too. Some travel and make it there. Some also stay back home and make it. But this traveling, if you are going under an agency that you know that it is a registered agency, there is no problem with that. But traveling, not knowing the agency's office, and after they take you there, some of them, they block you from talking to them and then telling them your problems or what you're facing out there. They block you. Some will even demand the money from you as you are there struggling and then suffering. When you complain of coming back home, some will always tell you things that will only hurt you. And the agencies there, you wouldn't know what agreement they have. Sometimes you feel like they've sold you out to the Gulf cities due to whatever you go in there. That is how I see it. So all I always say to myself is, I wish I could stop all this once, because we're suffering too much in the Gulf cities. When we Africans, we're suffering too much in the Gulf cities.
Thank you, Abena. Obviously, must be a reason why ladies from countries like yourself, yours in Ghana, and of course, here in Kenya and elsewhere in East Africa, because this is not trend is not just common to Kenya. We see that in Ethiopia, we see it in Uganda as well, and now quite recently also Rwanda. I imagine it's the same in West Africa. I imagine there are trends of people migrating not just from Ghana but also from Nigeria. and other countries in the region to the Gulf and other places in the Middle East. So there must be something that is driving people to travel and to migrate and to seek for work in these areas. What do you think this is? I mean, what do you think is driving, especially the women, to leave Ghana to go to Lebanon?
I think the salary differences. You know, back here in Ghana, you can't compare the dollar with the cedi, and the same in all the West African countries. When you hear of dollar and then you compare the dollar with your country currency rates, you'll be very happy to go out there to the Gulf cities to work. So I think it's the salary and the dollar rates that is driving the women from West Africa to work in the Gulf cities.
Is there any other reason beyond the, this higher possibility of earning a higher income?
I think that is the only thing, because to my experience and to the few ladies I have spoken to on phone, most of them will tell you when you are here in Ghana, no one will employ you and then pay you $200 a month. This is what everyone is saying. So to me, that is the very, very reason why they all travel from the West African countries to work in the Gulf cities.
Thank you. Maybe you can share with us, what is the difference then? How much would a domestic worker in Accra earn compared to how much a domestic worker, a Ghanaian domestic worker in Lebanon would earn, for instance? Assuming that this domestic worker in Lebanon has signed their contract and, has, is working for an employer that is paying their wages on time.
Yeah, I think here in Ghana, a company to employ you, let's say you have a basic education certificate, or we call something the senior high school level certificate. Any company that will employ you will only pay you something like 600 Ghana or 700 Ghana, which is $110 or $120. But here is the case: when you travel to the Gulf city, like somewhere like Lebanon, you will be paid $200 every month. And assuming you have a good employer, your employer takes care of you, your internet, food, clothing, everything. And at the end of the month, you take $200 to save for yourself. I think it's a win for you. But here in Ghana, if you are taking this 600 or 700 Ghana cedis, which is 120 or $110, you still have to pay your bills, pay your rents, buy clothing, or if you have kids, you need to feed your kids too as well. So this is one thing they always convince the women, and then they travel out of Ghana, because $200 to Ghana cedis is like 1,000 plus, 1,000 Ghana and then some little amount. So you comparing 1,000 with 600 in Ghana, you will be happy to travel to the Gulf city to work than being back home here.
Thank you, Abina. So speaking of Ghana and Lebanon, do you know if your country has signed a bilateral labor agreement with Lebanon? And if so, what does it provide in terms of the recruitment of migrant domestic workers?
All right, this issue, I've always been going crazy about this. I never knew anything about signing of bond or anything until my experience in Lebanon. Our sitting president now the vice president visited Lebanon in the year 2018, which was 2 years ago. And they had a meeting with the general security or something in Lebanon. And a bond was signed there. So, but the bond was only signed in Lebanon, not in Ghana. Most of our Ghanaian leaders, migrations and the rest know nothing about this bond. I don't know why he did that in Lebanon. And so we, the Ghanaian women, anytime you're facing any problem and you go to the Ghana consulate, he will only tell you, even when you talk about why this and this is, he will tell you your government was here and they legalized it. So you don't have to complain. If you say anything, you are at fault and not your employers or your sponsors. So actually, I don't really know what that bond was. I am yet to know. But in my country, there is nothing like we having a bond with the Lebanese government. There is nothing like that at all. But there in Lebanon, there is something that says that they have a bond with Ghana by the vice president. But in Ghana, there is nothing like that. We know nothing about this at all. I'm yet to find out where that bond was from and what was said in that very bond.
Thank you, Obina. Just moving on to a more personal question now, Obina. How would you describe your perhaps just what drove you to make this decision to migrate to Lebanon, and how would you describe your working and living experiences there once you got there?
As I said earlier on, the money, the dollar, and then the Ghana cedis. When you compare, because as to me, when I was working in a company here. It's a food production company. When I was working with them, I was only taking 380 Ghana cedis, which was not even up to $100. So to meet an agent for him to tell me you're going to work in the same company, a food production company in Lebanon, and you will be paid $200 every month. The company is going to give you accommodation, insurance, everything. I was so happy that my salary was going to double up 3 times what I'm taking here in Ghana. I was very, very happy. But arriving in Lebanon on the 23rd of March 2019, I noticed that no, it was a wrong thing for me to travel. You get to the airport, they take you to a small room, arrival, and then they will they take your passports as soon as you arrive. Then they start mentioning names. You see people will be moving one by one with their luggages. I was like, where is this? What kind of traveling is this? They told me it's a company. I thought we are all going under a company. But here is the case, we are being picked one by one. I was picked by my employer. He was a police officer. He took me home. Immediately you enter the house, they tell you to go take your shower. If you have hair, this African hair, they put in scissors to cut everything down. You take your shower, they search your bags. If you have a phone or you have money or you have something or you have things they don't want. After, then, whether at night you've eaten or no, work starts. In fact, I shed tears that day. I was like, whoa, this is not what they told me. And at that moment, you can't even make calls because you are not using a phone. It took me 3 days and I was taken back to the agency for them to know that the girl they requested for is in, and they picked me and I'm working now in their home. They took me there. I saw the agency in Lebanon. They spoke with me. That was where they told me they are going to deduct a 2-month salary from my working days in the house of my madam. I was like, how? They said that is the commission for your agents in Ghana. I said, no, nothing. There was no agreement like working and then salary will be deducted. But they told me I have no choice. I'm already there. And if I don't want, I need to pay them $2,000 so I could go back to my country or I stay to work. So the choice was in my hands now. I work with this boss for some time, but the wife was somehow crazy. She never liked anything that I do. When she got to know she was working in a salon, she got to know I was also doing this salon work. She wanted to be taking me to the salon. So it turned into a fight between she and then the husband. So I had no choice but to tell them to send me back to the agency. And that was where I faced hell in the agency. Back at the agency, They were using me for a daily work without salary. I worked for 3 months, no salary. So I had to, speak with the man and ask him why I am not being paid. And even if they are deducting 2 months, I still have a month I have worked. They need to pay me. He told me he can't pay me until I get an employer to employ me, make my papers for me before I could receive salary. I was pissed off, and it turned into a fight between me and the agency. So the man couldn't stand the heat from my side. He told me to take my bag and leave his office without my passport. That was when I ended up on the streets of Lebanon, not knowing anybody, without phone, not knowing where I'm going, didn't even know Beirut or anybody at all. So I ended up on the streets of Beirut, all alone with my God.
Thank you for that, Abina. Maybe my second last question. You're obviously now back home in Accra. Could you maybe share your experience about the repatriation process? How, who is it that supported you in this process? Ida shared hers. You say you found yourself on the streets of Beirut this year. How did you manage to get back home?
Oh, I managed to get back home by this is Lebanon. Because at the end, I think on the streets of Beirut, I fall into another agency's hand, which I was working. They also never paid me a dime. And so someone introduced me that go to Facebook, look for This is Lebanon, and they will help you. So I searched on Facebook, and then I was now having a phone. I searched on Facebook, I got them, spoke with them, and they talked to this agency, but this man was not willing to pay me. So I have to leave him, get to know some few friends, stay with them, and then life moves on. So during those seasons, I was always in touch with This is Lebanon, and I was arrested for some months. My family contacted them, and yes, they worked so hard. I was kept in custody for 3 months, but they worked so hard to get me out from the Lebanese police. And after 3 weeks, I was back home in my country. In fact, This is Lebanon did a whole lot for me. Coming out of jail, having nothing, they gave me food. They gave me some money to take care of myself. They introduced me to some few people, and those people gave me some little amount of money to keep on myself for my coming. And thanks to them, my name was submitted in the list of the people who are coming back home. That was 28th of August. I left Lebanon and back home to Accra safely. And thanks to This is Lebanon. If not for them, I don't actually know where I could have been till now. Whether in the police custody, whether in the street of Lebanon, I wouldn't know.
Thank you for that, Abina. My final question to you is, just tying it in with what you've shared with us about your experience in Beirut, and what Ali shared with us as well about what kafala means, and especially for migrant domestic workers. Obviously, Lebanon is one of the countries that prescribes to the kafala system. What do you think of it? And is there anything that you think needs to change about kafala, especially in Lebanon?
All right, I think kafala in Lebanon, they need to change a lot of things. Like before a sponsor or someone could employ someone from another country, the rules should be restructured for it to work, because I think the rules governing us isn't working at all. When you go to sign a contract or when they take you to the immigration to make your papers, there is a contract form, and when you go through the contract form and the treatment that they're treating you isn't the same. I think they need to restructure everything so that it could work for us. And if you are not ready to treat the person as stated in the contract form, there is no need to employ the person. And the government should do something also about that. If I'm being employed and I'm to work 8 hours, why should I work more than 8 hours? The government should do something about that. The employer, the sponsor should understand something about that. Our salaries too. You can't be working. Some are facing 7 months, no salary, 8 months, no salary. You can't be there working. Your family know you are there to work. Then it will take a year. You can't even send $1 back to your country, which is very painful. They need to, create something like human rights. Because in Lebanon, I know there is no rights govern us at all, domestic workers. Not at all. We don't have anything like rules govern us. Like Adele said, in Bahrain, you could report them to the police and you could get help. But in Lebanon, who are you to go to the police station to report your sponsors? There is nothing like that. They could rather report and you'll be arrested, whether you are of offense or no, whether you are wrong or right, they will just arrest you and put you behind bars without any reason, telling you anything at all. They will just tell you they are helping you, which is not right. The government of Lebanon needs to do something about this.
Thank you so much for that, Abina. We will now move on to Zain, who is our last speaker. But before we do, I'd like to encourage those who are listening in today to share their questions and their feedback so that we can respond to them during the Q&A in the next couple of minutes. Zain, thank you for participating in today's webinar. Before I ask you some questions about Kafala in Lebanon, perhaps I'd like to ask you to respond to what both Aida and Abina shared about the recruitment agencies. I mean, they both highlighted that they were deceived by the recruitment agencies that they used to go to Bahrain and Lebanon respectively. What are your thoughts on how these agencies could be regulated, and not just in countries of destination like Lebanon, but also countries of origin like Kenya and Ghana?
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate how horrible these institutions function right now. I mean, and it's a lot of, I think, human trafficking. Maybe what comes up in people's mind is, someone, bags over their head and they're taken somewhere. But what, if you look at the UN, what these agencies often largely function as is just human traffickers. And we actually, know in Kenya, for instance, we know the exact details of a Kenyan worker who just landed in Lebanon. As there's hundreds of Kenyans returning from Lebanon because no one's getting paid, because conditions are so bad. And yet recruiters are still illegally sending workers to Lebanon. And it's, even with, different types of bans and stuff, it just costs the agent $50 to bribe someone at the airport so that the worker is able to get through the Nairobi airport and go to Lebanon. And there's a lot of, in this case, we're kind of focusing on Kenya here, which does have at least a significant system for the regulation of agencies. Obviously, it's failing pretty significantly. Many other countries don't have any real regulation of agencies. I know even in Kenya, many of the workers who are recruited, the agents will bully the worker's mother into, really pressuring her under different, debt bondage or things like that, and forcing her to kind of send her daughter to places like Lebanon. And so, there's, I'd say the first thing is for there to be a very serious anti-human trafficking task force that's treating this like criminal human trafficking, and the types of sentences that are coming down on the perpetrators are the should be those of criminal human traffickers.
Thank you for that, Zain. You know, we've heard from both Abena and Aida about their experiences in Lebanon and Bahrain. You work with This is Lebanon, which of course works specifically with migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. And a lot has happened in Lebanon this year. Of course, you know, the August 4 blasts in Beirut that have obviously had an impact not just on the migrant workers in the country, but also on the locals as well. We've seen in the media, international media, about an economic crisis in Lebanon as well, that the country was grappling with even before COVID-19 hit this year. So how would you describe, I mean, how have all these different issues had an impact on African and Asian migrant workers in Lebanon?
Yeah, so for people who don't know the background, and about this time last year, actually, a kind of revolution started in Lebanon. There was already an economic crisis that had hit, but the difference is that about a few weeks or so after the revolution started, the economic crisis became very visible, and that is by the currency. The Lebanese lira is fixed to the dollar, 1,500 lira to $1, and it started fluctuating for the first time in decades now. And so what that means is that, you know, traditionally, you know, everyone with their money, they've got 1,500 lira, it's worth $1, and so kind of lira and dollar were pretty interchangeable. The money in, you know, the banks in Lebanon were considered, you know, some of the, you know, best banks in the world because they did well during the 2009 economic crash. You know, some people had already called the bluff on the banks, but, you know, it was still a common belief. And then that crash hit, and there's a lot of currency control, so people could hardly even withdraw money from the bank to live on. And then COVID-19 hit, which much exacerbated the economic crisis. The currency just, you know, was in a free fall for a while as well. The airport was locked down, so workers couldn't fly home. And many other of even a lot of their airports in their home countries were locked down. And then the Beirut blast hit on August 4th, which a lot of the effect of the blast wasn't, and you know, there were workers who died from it, there were workers who were injured from it, there were workers who lost their jobs. I'd say the bigger effect is that it just kind of changed the feeling of Lebanon, the economic woes. It made a feeling of hopelessness, and so which has hit a lot of people hardly. But in the context of employers who aren't very keen to treat their workers well, that they're acting with more audacity and more cruelty. That you know, there's no longer shame in not paying your worker. So the way they see it is that a year ago they paid, you know, $2,000 for this worker to come work for them for a couple years, and so they see it as they own this person for 2 years. Doesn't matter if they can pay him or not. And you know, even back in March, we had kind of started working together on the Send Us Home campaigns, specifically geared for workers in Lebanon. And you know, one of the things that you said, and you heard this, you hear this almost every time the workers talk about their plight there. On the first plane from Ghana, when they were interviewed in the Accra airport, you heard them saying this, and that we were treated like animals. And that's the truth. And we, in that, when we first started kind of writing it up, one of the things we were, you know, part of the message was that, you know, people will feed their dogs before they feed their workers. And as the news started talking about a large economic crisis, or a food crisis, a food shortage coming, that there's already, even before all this happened, there were already many employers who were starving their workers. And so just kind of every part of what is so awful about the system has just continued to get worse.
Thank you, Zain. And what you described is a very complex situation, and just thinking about the experiences of migrant domestic workers specifically. I mean, what does that mean for them, and why would you say they are more vulnerable to exploitation under kafala in Lebanon?
Yes, so I mean, really the big thing that this means for most workers in Lebanon is that many who, there's of course many employers who just never plan on paying their workers for whatever reason. And that's what we've traditionally dealt with. And traditionally, we have been able to fairly effectively for a large portion of those workers, we could at minimum get their employers to buy their plane ticket and send them home. Often, we could also get them sent home with their full salary. And now it's kind of rarely they're sent home with their salary. And even more rarely will the employer even buy their plane tickets. And so, and then they're in this situation where there's not a clear out. Because once they leave their employer's home, they're legal, they're homeless, their chance of getting their salary is drastically lower. But also now it's looking like, well, with many of these employers, there's no reason to believe that they're ever going to get their salary. So if they stay, every day is just another day of overworking and humiliation of slavery. But also if they leave, in many senses, they're leaving their chance of getting a salary. They're often leaving their chance of getting a plane ticket and things like that.
Thank you, Zain. Going back to kafala in now, we heard from Ali, and of course we know that Lebanon is not part of the GCC, but it prescribes to kafala. I mean, are there regulations and requirements for recruitment and residence of migrant domestic workers similar to what Ali described in Bahrain? Or is the system quite different in Lebanon?
Yeah, in Lebanon, really the only requirements are that the people who are supposed to get paid. And so as long as the right people are all getting paid, you can do whatever you want. And part of the reason is that there actually is no legal framework for kafala in Lebanon. And so everything hinges on General Security's mandate for issuing visas. And the ministry, and I do very much agree with Ali of how the news and other kind of sources, as they engage with this, try to call it a labor issue and really narrow down the scope. And of course, it is a labor issue, but it's so much bigger than that. And so, like in Lebanon, there's one law that has kind of anything to do with labor. And that law is that migrant domestic workers are excluded from all labor law. And so there is no really the Ministry of Labor guidelines, the contracts that they have and all that, for a variety of reasons, they're not enforceable by the worker in almost any scenario. And so it's all just this one-sided relationship where the system functions just as a property ownership system for the employers to have full control and autonomy over these people who come to work for them. And of course, there are some employers who want to treat workers well as human beings, but there's many who aren't. And it's just the roll of the dice. It's a gamble on what type of employer you're getting. And there's no mechanisms in the legal system in the country for any sort of restitution or justice for employers who want to act otherwise. And General Security, as they're the ones who are truly kind of created this system and keep it moving from day to day. They get a large amount of their money from the system, so they have a very vested interest through the visas. And just time and time again, as we observe them, how they respond to situations that they're responding, and just without any regard for the worker, acting in the interest of the employer.
Thank you, Zain. Maybe before I move on to my next question, just a point of clarification. You've talked about the general security, but maybe for the sake of our Kenyan listeners who might not be very familiar with the context in Lebanon, what is the general security, and what is their mandate exactly?
Yeah, so general security, they're under the Ministry of Interior, and they're just kind of your basic, what you think of as police. So you go to the police station, that's general security. But in Lebanon, I don't know about like in Kenya what the police do. In Lebanon, for instance, general security generally does a lot more than maybe police would most often do. And so the fact that the same people who are just doing like normal police duties are also the ones signing visas, enforcing visas, things like that, I think it is quite unusual and a very problematic system, but that specifically comes down to bear pretty hard on the migrant domestic workers.
Thank you for that, Zain. So over the years, we've seen different actors, including trade unions, activists from all over the world, non-profit organizations as well, and migrant workers themselves call for the abolishment of the kafala system. What do you think has driven these demands? And of course, we've seen that happening in Lebanon as well. What do you think is driving these demands for the complete abolishment of kafala?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll just run through real quick. This is the list of abuses that we also see through kafala. And because of a combination of the mechanisms that kafala has created and kind of the racism that both it perpetuates as well as drives it, allows, and that includes child labor, false detention or imprisonment, human trafficking. It's, murders go without investigation almost every single time. There's often suicides or failed escapes. A worker will attempt to escape through a second or third story floor. No question is asked about why or what exactly is going on. There's restrictions on freedom of movement for almost every single worker. We actually only record when there's no restriction on freedom of movement, which has never happened with one of our cases. If you take the Rome definition of torture, which is the one that the International Criminal Court uses, that it includes psychological torture. And so every single one of our cases experiences at least that form of torture. Non-payment of salary, overworking, often over 100 hours a week, 80 to 90 is very normal. Physical abuse, refusing to send home, just keeping them as forced labor. Sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, untreated illness or injury. I think Ida told that as part of her story, and that's very common. Starvation, and then just being thrown out in the street when they're supposed to be a responsible party for this person's well-being. So those are all things that we've consistently seen, and I think others have seen that often as well. And that's, it's like, why would there be a system that allows these things and there to be no avenue for restitution or justice for anyone who experiences them? When Dipendra worked at the honorary consulate, the Nepali honorary consulate in Beirut, he saw 72 women go home in caskets, in coffins, and only one of them was there an arrest. And there was an arrest because the murderer was a Syrian man. And so they were willing to arrest a Syrian man, but not a Lebanese man. And then even as we've tried through many avenues, through international lawyers from an organization that's taken cases to the International Criminal Court, to some of the top human rights organizations in Lebanon, we've never seen really one case of what you'd see like, wow, this is a success. The closest thing was a woman who was raped by her employer, who's a police officer. She took the case to the court. Criminal charges were not even being considered. But through the civil court, she got a settlement of a few $1,000s. And that was only because she was pregnant with his baby. But most often in those scenarios, the employer just forces the worker, takes her to the doctor and forces her to get an abortion just to hide the evidence. So most times that's not even an option. And so it's not, modern day slavery is a little bit of an understatement. It's just state-sponsored slavery, and it's beyond slavery because it's mixed with almost every type of human rights abuse you can imagine as just being something that's allowed and perpetuated by the system.
Thank you, Zain. So if kafala was to be abolished, then what should replace it? What is the ideal policy or law or regulation that should, govern the recruitment of foreign workers in countries like Lebanon and elsewhere in the Middle East? What is the ideal situation in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that I say with this is, as conditions currently exist in Lebanon, I don't have confidence that any of these measures that have been implemented in the Gulf would actually work as a functional system in aiding the real problems that migrant domestic workers are facing. Earlier this year, there was a big celebration of the end of kafala in Lebanon, because they have this new big unified contract. And first off, we said from the beginning, right after they announced it, it was a faux attempt at reforming or abolishing kafala. The contract, there's already a contract, and that contract, it's up to the goodwill of the employer on whether they want to enforce it or uphold it. And there is no enforcement against it, except for the enforcement against the worker. So it's a one-sided contract, and there's no new enforcement mechanism in the new proposed contract, so that the worker can have someone who is with them to have it enforced against the employer. And so without that enforcement mechanism, it's just as worthless as the last contract. What it does do is it sets a standard of norms. And so employers who do want to follow the rules, yeah, sure, they'll probably, some people will get better conditions through the goodwill of their employers, just because their employers want to follow the rules. But it's not because the state is fundamentally changing in a way to reorient itself to provide rights for workers. And even the person who proposed the new contract, the caretaker minister of labor, when she was interviewed afterwards about the problems of kafala, she actually blamed it on the fact that there were so many illegal domestic workers and that she only had 10 labor inspectors. Well, we don't even see those 10 labor inspectors really doing anything regardless. That's a much larger team than we have in terms of direct caseworkers. And so she abdicated all responsibility from the Ministry of Labor and actually doing anything about that. But even with all of that, we can't officially confirm this, but have been told this, have reason to believe it, that the proposed reforms that are supposed to come through have already been rejected. And it makes sense that they would be rejected, because it's in the law that domestic workers are excluded from all labor laws. So how's the minister going to enact labor rights for migrant domestic workers? And and even if that one part of the law, you know, there's just so many interested parties, especially as the economy worsens. You know, the Lebanese have less and less ability to have domestic workers, and they've relied on them so heavily that they're not keen with the idea of these employers and agencies aren't keen with the idea of having even less access to domestic workers. And so I think in terms of what it would take for, you know, conditions in Lebanon to change so that it would be livable and suitable conditions for migrant domestic workers, it would take just an entirely new mandate, entirely new kind of you know, organization working or something that's collaborating with some of the leaders from the migrant domestic worker community. You know, what we see in the Lebanese state as a government is that, you know, just the level of disregard and racism is so severe that you can't have people who are operating under those premises who are going to bring any sort of justice or equity to workers.
Thank you so much, Zain. We have 10 minutes left before the panel comes to an end, so I won't ask you any other question, but I will open it up to our listeners and you know, our participants now, and read out a few questions and responses and feedback that we're getting from the people who are listening in. There is a question, and I think I'll direct that to Ali, and it's something that was actually echoed by both Ida and Abena. It's a gentleman called Troy who is saying that, you know, what can we do to stop ladies or Africans from traveling to work in these Gulf countries where they're being forced to work as slaves? Ali, what is your take on that? Because this is something that also we had both Ida and Abena saying that perhaps the solution to these challenges that domestic workers and other workers, migrant workers, are facing in countries like yours, Bahrain, and other countries in the GCC and the Middle East is to stop people from actually going there. What is your take on that, especially given that you also work for an organization that is advocating for the rights of these migrant workers?
I mean, I kind of disagree with the question. I think everyone has right to move, no matter what. And I don't think it's a right thing to say to, like, the question of what we can do to stop women to leave is just, I find it strange. And I think one thing we can work on is like the need for a cross-border labor organizing that challenges the exploitative conditions both in the Gulf countries and sending countries. So migrating should not be a force, but like a wish to go. The right of staying and moving should both be equal rights. And like we have to emphasize on, of course, on the structural causes of, you know, underdevelopment in countries such as Kenya and other places. Also, I think it's critical now, especially that, you know, the Gulf countries are facing, you know, a crisis in fall of oil revenues, and then we have the Corona crisis. I think it is very likely to see that we will see, you know, a more authoritarian labor market. I mean, we also see it now even for nationals, and there needs to be a pushback, but you know, one always has to try to look to possible openings for change, even a few. But I think again, like going back, like it has to be everyone should have a right to stay or leave, no matter what. I mean that, and I want to say that. That being said, you know, we have to aim to make it safe to migrate and stay and reside and work in a safe environment, and that, you know, means putting in place legislation, proper migration framework for the safety of everyone.
Thank you very much for that, Ali. I'll move on to the next question now. Is a question about social attitudes towards migrant workers. And the question is, outside of labor laws and regulations, do you think there's a need for a change in social attitudes towards migrant workers? Many have talked about the racist treatment and abuse they've received from their employers, including not being allowed to eat from the same plate, and to participate in the same leisure activities as the families that they work for. I believe this is in reference to migrant domestic workers. So I think maybe I can ask Zain to respond to that, and perhaps after that, both Abina and Aida as well. So Zain, over to you. Maybe something about your perspective on this question, on the change in social attitudes towards migrant workers.
Yeah, actually, there was a couple months ago a webinar hosted by Impact Lebanon, which included a lot of the leaders in Lebanon who were advocating, to the abolishment of kafala and such. And one of the kind of debates they had on there was like, what came first, kind of the racism toward the migrant domestic workers, or kafala, the chicken or the egg. And I think that's kind of beyond anything I can speculate on. But what I can say is that it's really unimaginably severe. And so one little story, there's one of the women on our team, she's from Central Africa. She was born and raised in Lebanon, and both parents are from Central Africa. And so she spoke fluent English, French, and Arabic. And she was young in college or uni. She worked at a store, just a normal job at a store, just as a normal worker, all that. And not under kafala, because she had a different type of residency permit. And when she quit, and actually the owner of that store went to her church even, and it was coming up on her semester, so she said, "Okay, I'm quitting." He said, "Well, I'm going to call the police." She said, "Well, why are you calling the police?" And it was just because that's what many Lebanese employers are used to, that when there's a Black person who's working for you and they try to quit, you call the police, and the police comes and makes them keep working for you, because that's the expectations that have come under kafala. And so kafala, it's like everyone of the ethnicities of these migrant domestic workers is now kind of viewed through that lens of, I'm going to treat these people as poorly as we treat these workers. And so it's, and that's kind of why I say under current conditions, it's kind of like there's so much more than just the legislative aspect, than just the rights. Just a few, one of the members on our team is a domestic worker before. There was like a year in Lebanon where she was too afraid to use public transportation because of having been sexually violated so many times on it. And so she'd, walk much further distances and such just to avoid it. But it's very deeply ingrained, problematic and racist views that perpetuate this, aside from just any kind of legal structures.
Thank you so much for that, Zain. Abina, could you just very quickly, because we only have 2 minutes left now, respond to what Zain has shared? What do you think can be done to change some of these negative attitudes towards migrant workers that Zain has highlighted in Lebanon and elsewhere in the Middle East?
Oh, okay. To me, what I think I should add something to what Zain said. All they need to do is to restructure everything for domestic workers when it comes to, let's say, being employed and then something like working hours. We need rest, our salaries to be paid, and there should be a rule governing we, the domestic workers. And I think everything will be perfect. We wouldn't be struggling. And most of them, when you're working with them and you want to quit, as Zain said, they threaten you with the police. All those things need to stop. Even when you are not being paid and you ask for your salary, they threaten you with the police. They should also know that we are also human like them. They shouldn't differentiate we and them with our color. No, we are all the same. And so they need to also respect us as well. We may be working and may decide to quit. Yeah, we are human. They could sit we down, talk to us as their sisters or daughter or a friend, talk to us and we could understand things rather than threatening we with the police. I think things like this could be perfect when it comes to this domestic workers suffering and other stuffs. And most, as you said earlier on, most wouldn't even allow you to eat with them on the same table. Some would even give you a different plate and a cup. For God's sake, before you enter into any Gulf city, you go to the lab for tests. If you are sick, you wouldn't go. And when immediately you go to Lebanon or any other Gulf city, they also take you for a lab. So why should they be treating us as if we are slaves or animals? No. We are workers. They should treat us like the way their bosses also treat them at their workplaces. That's all I got to say.
Thank you, and that's a really good summary to today's webinar, that migrant workers should be treated just by their employers the same way that these employers are treated in their own workplaces. Ali, I will ask you to perhaps just summarize some of the key points from today's webinar, and one of the last things that you said that I thought was very very useful was the importance of establishing this cross-border labor organizing, coming up, establishing relationships and partnerships between organizations in countries of origin, like Kenya and Ghana, and countries of destination like Bahrain and Lebanon. You've also obviously highlighted the need for safe migration. Is there any, in summary, just based on what we've had today from all the panelists, anything else that has struck you? And as we continue this discussion about Kafala and the need for the reforms.
I just want to make a point that although we spoke a lot about Kafala, and it can turn into that for people that if you abolish Kafala, everything is resolved. But though it's important to understand that while Kafala exacerbates many of the issues migrant workers face, abolish it will not really resolve all of the issues. The private sector in the Gulf is a harsh environment, and it's extremely biased towards the interest of employers, with or without Kafala. I mean, there is no right to unionize, and it's true that the Kafala systems where migrant workers are in transit state, it's very difficult to unionize, but in some places unionizing is just illegal, like in Saudi Arabia. Justice systems in the Gulfs are weak, unfair, with or without Kafala. I think like we can, though it is an aim that we should go for to abolish Kafala, I think until we get there, we could, for example, although it's not enough, but these surface changes that we see, for example, like in Qatar recently, or we can work on a targeted advocacy to abolish the worst tenets of Kafala, such as abolishing exit permits in Saudi Arabia, or allowing workers to change employment without employers' consent. It's insufficient, but still these basic changes have a real improvement for migrants, until we can move to a system where the state holds the responsibility of the residency of migrant workers and not the private individual. And in any way, I personally think that integrating migrants fully into Gulf societies as equals to nationals means changing the whole political and economic system of the Gulf. So it's a really difficult, but one step at a time, and it does absolutely require cross border labor organizing to international organizations and also domestic organizations to work hard to do that.
Thank you very much, Ali, and Abena, Aida, Zain as well. We have come to an end of our webinar, Kafala Explained. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, sharing your experiences. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to take any more questions from our participants, but we have been recording this webinar and we will upload it to the Centers Home Kenya YouTube page. And of course, we will keep providing some updates on our Twitter page as well as to when this recording will be put up. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's been, following us during the last 2 hours, and to thank the panelists once again for sharing their insights and having the courage as well to both Aida and Abina to share their experiences. So thank you very much and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.